I just remember that Jackie was real frantic, when she called. She was kind of yelling and hollering and kind of uncertain of what was going on. And right in the middle of the phone call, I remember she suddenly yelled out,
"Ah! I'm not staying here, Barry. I'm out of here. I gotta get out of here. I can't stay here."
And we asked what had happened. She said, well, she'd been hit by a can of Coke or something and had flown across the room and hit her in the back. And that's why she'd stopped talking, because she'd stopped talking for a few seconds there. We're like, well, what happened? What's going on? And she came back to the phone and explained that something had hit her in the back, flown across the room, and it was a can of Coke or something had hit her in the back. So things were flying off the shelves and off the tables and hitting her as we were talking to her on the phone. She was yelling for us to get down there. She had to leave. She wanted to get out of there. She wanted us to come down because she was just really frightened, didn't know what was going on, and basically wanted to get out of there.
What happened when you arrived at the house?
Well, when we first arrived, it didn't seem to be any anything particular wrong or going on or anything different about it. It's kind of a long ride down there, and we talked about several things on the way down. Jeff was talking about these brand new glasses that he bought, so it's just kind of casual chit-chat on the way down. There was almost a half an hour drive from where we were down to San Pedro. And so we were talking about a lot of different things, and we arrived and kind of walked around, and everyone was saying, well, things were happening. They were hearing noises and things up in the attic. So Jeff and I decided to go up into the attic, and that's when things really started happening. One of the things that people were saying as we were around the room, I forget how many different people there was 3 or 4 people there, but they're all saying that from the previous time, the things that they heard, and it was all the typical things you hear about, these hauntings, whether they're real or not. It's like, well, do you hear these noises in the attics? Things kids are afraid of their whole life. You hear bumps and noises up in the attic. So that's what they were talking about. So Jeff and I thought, well, we'll go up in the attic, check it out.
And what was Jackie's state of mind when you first got to the house, Gary? What do you remember about that?
Well, she was a lot more, calm than she was when we were talking to her on the phone. She was pretty frantic when we first talked to her when she called us in. But by the time we got there, she was, a little more rational, I guess you'd say. Okay, well, it was the first time I had been in the attic. And I think Jeff had been up there one other time. In fact, the only other time he'd been to the house. But we went up into the attic, and we're just kind of looking around. The attic was, nothing spectacular at all. In fact, it was completely empty. There wasn't a box. There wasn't anything up in the attic at all, except I think a little open grape box or something sitting in one corner. So there's nothing in there that anything could have been in or hidden behind or anything like that. It was empty, if nothing else to note. It was very small. It was just a small 4-room house, so the attic wasn't much. So you could only stand right in the very center of it, and it was designed such that there were, I'm not sure the right building term, but there were beams holding from the center of the roof on the outside down to the center of the attic. So as you're looking down the attic, it was kind of a V-shaped appearance, because there were these support beams coming down from the middle of the attic roof to the center of the attic. And we walked all the way down to one end and kind of looked around. There wasn't anything to see, and turned around and started coming back, but there just wasn't wasn't anything going on or anything to note up there.
What was the first indication that something was amiss?
Well, the first thing we heard that we walked up there, and we could hear all kinds of noises and things from people downstairs. All of a sudden, everybody started yelling and hollering, and you guys get down here, and there's something going on down here. Get down here right away. And again, the mood in the attic at that point was that Jeff and I had walked from one end to the other, and nothing was going on. It's like, well, why are they yelling downstairs? What's going on? And I just kind of shrugged my shoulders, and I walked away from Jeff towards the opening, which was in one corner of the attic. But there's definitely, nothing upstairs to note. It just all of a sudden they started yelling downstairs. Well, Jackie was down there, and Barry Conrad was down there. In fact, he was the one I think I heard the most, because he had seen a red light or something fly across the room and into one of the curtains. And I think that was, why we headed that way, because he was saying, I just saw something down here. I just saw a light. I described it as a red light, which everything else we'd heard after that point was they were strictly usually white lights or white, balls of light, cloud-like structures. And he had said, was yelling he had seen a red light fly across the room and into a curtain. And he was right just immediately below the opening at that point.
Why did you leave Jeff behind?
Again, we just kind of, we looked, I turned and looked at him and kind of, shrugged my shoulders. It's like, well, why are they yelling? There's nothing going on, at least as far as we could see upstairs. And I assumed that he was walking, right behind me, that we would both walk that way. But it was kind of like, well, one of us ought to go look, see what's going on down there. So since I was closer to the opening at that point, that's why I turned and walked that way. Okay, well, actually I wanted to give a little bit of background because when we went up in the attic, and this is kind of an important point to me, is that the only thing we took with us was a flashlight and a very small camera, just like an Instamatic type small camera. And Jeff had the flashlight and I had the camera, just as it happened. So when I turned and walked away from him, I could see because he had the flashlight on, and I could see, certainly the opening that I was walking towards. But as I approached the opening, and you see that in the videotape that Barry Conrad was shooting at that point, you can just see when I just got up to the opening, and that was the point that Jeff yelled out, and when he did, he dropped the flashlight. So if you can just kind of picture what was happening there, we had at least the light of the flashlight and the light coming up from the opening, and as soon as he dropped the flashlight, the attic went dark. So you see me approach the opening, I had the camera in my hand, just kind of loosely holding it. I wasn't planning on taking any pictures or anything at that point. I was just looking down into the opening to see why everyone was yelling downstairs. And at that point, Jeff dropped the flashlight, he yelled out.
What's wrong? What happened?
And I turned around to see now, why was he yelling? So, what was going on there.
I told you, get down, get down!
So the first thing that I could see in looking back towards him was that from just what little light was coming up from the opening, he was wearing a white shirt, but I could see that he wasn't standing up straight. And for some reason, this image of this dim view of this white shirt was that he was about on a 45-degree angle. He was not standing up straight, which immediately struck me as odd, besides the fact that he just yelled out and dropped the flashlight. One of the questions that I get asked the most is it's like, well, why did I take a picture? Why didn't I run to help him or see what was going on or whatever? And the reason was, as I said, when he dropped the flashlight, the attic went dark, so I couldn't see. So I had this camera in my hand, so my first reaction was simply to raise the camera and take a photograph of why was he on this 45-degree angle I couldn't see anyway, kind of thing. And then I could see that what was, as you see in one of the photographs there, he was wrapped around one of these boards that was coming down on an angle from the ceiling, and he was like holding onto this thing for dear life, but yet there was absolutely no expression on his face. It was like completely blank. So obviously I knew there was something wrong or something had happened to him. And I jumped up and I had to take about one step forward and then turn to the left to go back down through the center of the attic. And once again I realized I couldn't see because at that point I was walking away from the light. And again, everyone says, why'd you take all these pictures? Well, once again, I could not see. The only source of light that I had was the flash from the camera in my hand. So I took a second picture as I was about halfway to him because I didn't want to trip over the loose boards and things that were there at the bottom of the attic. Exactly at the same time that I took the flash picture, because I never could figure out why we couldn't see when I took the flash picture on the tape that he had taken. And finally came to realize that it was at the exact same instant when he flicked on that light is when the flash occurred from taking the photograph of the first one. And then the second one I took on the way going to Jeff, because once again, since he dropped the flashlight, we only had one flashlight between the two of us, and he dropped the flashlight, so that's why I couldn't see to get over to him until I took a second picture to make sure I wasn't going to trip over something. What was interesting about when I first got over to Jeff, he did two things which he contradicted himself, just one thing after another. When I first got up to him, he had started to relax, and because I said he was originally like gripping around this board in the attic, just holding on to it, and he started to relax a little bit, and as I approached him, he said, the first thing he said to me was, "There's something on my neck." Now, I had heard from the time that they had been down there before, they had talked about being pushed or feeling something behind them or things like that, which I didn't know myself. But when he said, "There's something on my neck," and he said it very clearly, I put my hand behind his head, at his neck to see if there really was something physically there. And I don't remember exactly what I said to him. I know what he said, but he said something, he said, "There's something on my neck." And I said, "Well, I don't think there's anything there," or something to that effect. And then he almost became angry. He said, "There's nothing on my neck." So he said two things which contradicted each other. First he said, "There's something on my neck." Then he said, "There's nothing on my neck." And he said it almost like he was angry the second time. And again, by this point, he had started to relax and was almost standing upright once again. And that's when I noticed that the rope was there on his neck.
It's kind of interesting because he looks like he's out of it. He looks like he's confused or dazed. Describe Jeff's, that image that you got.
Okay, yeah, there was, it was just a totally blank expression on his face. His eyes were open, but it was almost like he was asleep or something like that. He just was, there was nobody home, I guess you'd say. He was just a totally blank expression on his face. Okay,
and when you asked him what had happened to him, again, how did he respond to you?
Well, again, when I first approached him, he was, starting to come out of it, I guess you would say. And again, he said, "There's something on my neck," which was kind of a monotone, not a particular emotion to it. But when he said, "There's nothing on my neck," it was really in anger. I mean, it's like, "There's nothing on my neck," and he, really said it in anger.
What do you think about that rope, Gary? Was that rope, in your opinion, was that rope up there already? Or did you guys see that rope up in the attic prior to the hanging, or was that something that just came out of the blue?
No, we didn't. We did not see the rope ahead of time. We didn't really study the attic thoroughly at that point. But as I said, there was really nothing up there. There was no boxes or anything where something could have been, unless it was just lying on the floor of the attic. The rope itself was one of these plastic clothesline type ropes. It was very dirty, so I mean it was very likely it could have already been up there. It doesn't necessarily have to have appeared out of nothing. I mean it's likely it could have been there, but we didn't certainly find it, and I certainly didn't see. I didn't pick it up. He didn't pick it up. None of us had seen that ahead of time, and it wasn't there that we had seen ahead of time, but it could have been up there just by the appearance of it.
In your opinion, do you think there were supernatural forces at work in the attic that night, and in that house in general?
I don't know if I'd really make that statement myself as far as certainly not supernatural. The way I look at it afterward, and in all the time I spent up in the attic afterward and things like that, there were no other entrances to the attic. There was, as I said, no boxes, something somebody could have hidden behind or things like that. I kind of just looking at it logically, it was not possible anyone else could have been up there and have done that. I mean, it just was not possible. There's anyone else up there. The attic was empty. It was very small, and as I said, there's no place to hide, no other access. So for one, it was not possible anyone else could have done it. I could not have done that. For one thing, I was in the video. You can see that yourself, and of course, I know myself. That I did not do that. I was about 10 or 15 feet away from him when he called out, when it occurred, and probably not even that far. It's just a few footsteps away from him. And again, I was in the video. The third possibility is, whether this is something somehow Jeff could have fabricated himself, which once again, there's just no way that was possible in the amount of time, because it happened in just a few footsteps away from him is when this occurred. He would not have had time. He would not have known where the nails were, and there were only 2 nails in the entire attic, and I found that from later study of it. And he would not have known where those were. He could not have found the rope in that period of time. I certainly didn't see him pick it up or anything like that while we walked up there for the short time we were up there. And probably the most telling thing to me was that he could not or would not have done this is because in the process of whatever happened to him, the glasses he was wearing had fallen to the floor of the attic. Now these were just brand new glasses. I mean, he was talking about them on the trip down there. It was about a half-hour ride, as I said before, and he's talking about these new glasses and how he picked them out and liked the frames and on and on and on. And somebody just buys a new pair of glasses, for whatever reason, would not throw them on the floor of the attic where either one of us could have stepped on them very, very easily. And of course, later on, as soon as he gets down, that was again, once he was kind of coming back out of it, that was one of his first concerns was, where are my glasses? Would you go and find my glasses? And again, he didn't know that until after he got downstairs that he even wasn't wearing them. So, someone who just buys a new pair of glasses, is not going to just throw them on the floor of the attic where we could have very easily stepped on it. I found them right away. It was right where he was standing, where I found him. But, it's not something he would have done. One other thing on, of course, the force possibility, as you said, is whether it was, some other force or something like that. I mean, that's, just leaves no other explanation because it wasn't someone else, it wasn't one of us. So what else could it be?
Were you skeptical going into it, Gary, or were you open-minded, or what was your general mindset going into this thing?
Well, I'd say a little bit of both. Certainly, skeptical because I had not been there before. They were talking about being pushed and all these things happening the first time anyone went down there. But again, I had not experienced it myself or anything like that. Certainly open-minded to the point where you hear about these things happening, and a lot of it, as I said before, was just like the typical things you hear, noises in the attic, people being pushed, objects being thrown across the room, all the same things you've heard, for years and years and years, this type of thing that happens. So it all sounded way, very, very typical, but whether it was very real, I hadn't seen yet.
Did that night change your mind?
Well, wasn't any changing, I guess, to it or something like that. It's just, now I had actually seen, these things for myself. And can relate to them, and it seems like most people I've even talked to since then, most people will say at some point in their life, it's like, oh yeah, I heard about this, or I was in this house and I thought this happened. And I think a lot of people have these things happen to them. They kind of file them away as just being, well, probably something they wouldn't even talk to anybody about. But if I ever relate this story to them, then they come out and say, oh yeah, I've heard this and heard that. And of course, this was something that was very, very firsthand experience I had in over a long period of time. Okay, one other comment on why Jeff possibly couldn't have done this himself as far as the hanging and everything, is the rope was so tight around his neck, and as you can see from the photographs, that he was, just unconscious. I mean, his eyes were open, but he just plain wasn't there. And someone in that situation, when you whatever come back or whatever you want to say from being unconscious, if you're restricted in some way, the first reaction anyone would have would be to panic. And in that situation, he was, very tight up against the inside of the roof. And if he would have panicked, he would have hurt himself. If not, some people say possibly have strangled, because he would not have been able to get himself off of there. Certainly not in that condition of coming back and all of a sudden finding yourself, hung by the neck by this rope. He just would have panicked and probably would have hurt himself. Even I there had to bend the nail down, as I said before, to get him off, and get the rope off of that nail. And again, he would not have been able to do that himself.
Yeah, December 4th, 1990, Gary, I understand you, Barry Conrad, Jeff Wheatcraft had videotaped a Christmas party in Beverly Hills. And when you returned to Barry's home, what did you find?
Okay. Well, this evening was probably the most entertaining of any of the events in this thing. We got back. It was about maybe 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning from the shoot that we all did together, and Jackie had visited Barry's apartment on the Friday before. Now this was on a Sunday night. She had visited there on a Friday, just 2 days before that. She didn't stay very long. She just visited and left. And whatever this was, whatever we're dealing with here, had apparently stayed behind, and nothing really happened on that Saturday. But that Sunday when we returned, we were carrying equipment back from the van outside into the apartment where everything was kept. And this is all, very expensive equipment. We each had, 5 or 6 trips to make. There was a lot of equipment to bring in. And so it's like not a time when anybody be fooling around or whatever. Well, the first thing we noticed, there was a can of Coke was set right in the middle of the doorway. Somebody tripped over it or whatever, and I think I found that. Didn't really think much of it, just like, what's that doing there? Move it out of the way. Continue to carry equipment in and out. Well, then something else was set right in the middle of the doorway. And about that time, the three of us arrived at the door at the same time and realized, hey, something's going on. Now, one thing that was common to this, whatever this was at Barry's apartment, is that it liked to turn the gas stove burners on in the kitchen. So again, as soon as we saw this second object placed in the doorway, we immediately just said, let's go in the kitchen, let's see what's in there. Well, we go in the kitchen, and 3 of the burners on the gas stove, they were just roaring. They were going full blast. And of course, we'd not even been in the kitchen. We were carrying stuff into the front room where it was stored. And obviously, and then we knew something was going on. At that point, we knew something was going on. We started getting other equipment, the equipment we had in the van. We started getting it back together again to try to maybe see if we could get something on tape. And just anything had happened. We also had a little 1/2-inch camcorder, and we used that. I ended up using that. And this was about 2 in the morning. Over the course of the next 3.5 hours, something occurred in that apartment about every 5 minutes, that something took place. To kind of document that, I got up the next morning and I wrote down a list, and I think I had 42 items on this list of things that occurred. Now this was 42 different things. This was not, some of the things occurred anywhere from 5 to 15 different times. The gas burners were turned on probably 20 or 25 times during that time, and that counted as one item. So the next morning I wrote down 42 different things that occurred. These were things like a flashlight would be turned on and placed in an odd position. One time it was sitting up on end, and with the beam going straight up to the ceiling. Another interesting point, a very heavy commercial tripod with the legs collapsed, that is all 3 legs together, was balanced in the middle of the bed in his bedroom, and it was perched perfectly straight up and down in the middle of the bed, balanced. Now, a person could not do this and stand there and get something balanced like that, and yet whatever this was, wanted this tripod to set perfectly upright in the center of the bed with the points down, and it was perfectly balanced there. We saw objects being thrown across the room different times. Jeff and I observed at one point we were in the kitchen of this apartment, and we were standing apart from each other in kind of a triangular shape, and there was a bottle of typewriter whiteout which was sitting on top of the typewriter, and this was picked up from the top of the typewriter, and I didn't actually see it rise, but it happened in front of Jeff and I and went behind Barry's back, so he didn't actually see this happen except by the expression on her face. But we saw this come kind of from behind Barry. It floated across the room just as neat as anything. No one was touching it, and when it got about to the point of the kitchen sink, it then dropped to the floor. And at that point, Barry saw our reaction, on our faces, and he's like, what happened? Well, at that point, the object hit the floor, and he turned and looked, and of course he saw what happened, but he didn't actually see that. But that happened right, the lights are on, right just in front of both Jeff and I, and actually went behind Barry, so he didn't actually see that happen. probably the most eventful thing that occurred there was something once again which happened to Jeff, and he was standing by some bookshelves in what amounted to the front room or the living room of the apartment, and I walked in from the kitchen. One of the reasons for that is because I kept going into the kitchen to check for the burners being turned on, because sometimes they were not always fully turned on to the point where it would ignite. So there were several times I went in there, maybe one burner was turned on, another one was half on enough to where there was gas, coming out, but it wasn't lit. So I was very concerned about that. So I kept going in there to check, make sure that they weren't just partially on. But as I was coming back from the kitchen into the living room area, Jeff was standing to my left, facing straight in front of me, not facing me, but facing straight in front. And as I stopped in the doorway of the living room, I saw something, I don't know how to describe it, just a small ball of light is the expressions usually used for this, about the size of a pencil eraser. It was about that large. It was kind of a gray color. It wasn't emitting light, it was just something that was there. And it appeared about 2 feet in front of me and 2 feet in front of Jeff, because the way we were standing was about there. And it did not move in a straight line. It moved in an arc going downward. It went down and then up into his chest. I saw a light start about at this point here, about say 1.5 feet in front of him, and fly into his chest. Just saw it fly right into him. And again, he didn't seem to react to anything like that happened. I started to mention it to him, the fact that I saw something fly into his chest, when all of a sudden he was thrown back against the wall. And I had a 1/2-inch camcorder on my shoulder, which was not recording at that particular moment.
Good. What was Jeff's reaction then?
He didn't react at all. And initially, when I saw this more or less fly into his chest, I looked from seeing the object up to his face, and once again, there was really no expression on his face, but it wasn't blank like it was in the attic. He just, didn't seem to react. And as I started to speak to ask him if he just felt something, or what just happened type of thing, he fainted. His eyes went half closed, and he started to collapse. And he no sooner dropped about maybe 4 or 5 inches when he was suddenly picked up and thrown back up against the bookshelves behind him. And he was lifted high enough in the air that his arms were then over the tops of the very top of these bookshelves before he then fully dropped to the floor. How far that would be? Probably about maybe 1.5 feet or so. He was lifted up into the air high enough that his arms were then over the tops of these bookshelves.
All of a sudden, Gary was saying something was flying towards me, and all of a sudden I feel like I'm being pushed up right like this by the neck or something, but I didn't feel anything strong on me. That's the strangest thing. It just felt like something was motivating me from inside just to pull me up here.
And he then collapsed to the floor. And about that time, Barry ran up to grab him because he was off in the further away in the room. But again, these things like this happen. It's like it never happens either when we're recording or just flat out the equipment does not operate when something is happening or is about to happen. In this case, we just were not recording at that particular instant. And that's very typical of this whole case. Things either don't operate or we're just not doing it at that particular time.